You are a woman in today's world. How do people expect you to act? Like, for example, where it could be things that you wear. It could be ways
you speak or
ways that you speak, where
dress.
you work, what you do, if you have kids, if you're in a relationship, are you independent or dependent?
Right.
Yeah. Could be, are you expected to wear makeup? You know, what does dressing up look like to you? I'm happy to list them off, but I'd love to make space to hear from you.
Or maybe
all.
doing the cooking or the laundry.
Yes.
Or, yeah.
Yeah, okay, so to be proper, to cook, to do laundry, to be like the primary care provider for kids, to do all the emotional labor. And in this century, to work and then to come home and to do all that labor.
Right.
Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of nods. Okay. How do you think that relates to this video?
I think they're trying to conform. Like, this is what you were, this is what we expect you to be, this is how you have to be, and then it's like, I can't identify with that, I can't. So I think there's a little bit of conformist
Totally.
aspect to it.
So when we watch the video a second time, watch the beginning with the family structures, you'll notice that there's and as well as at the church setting, but there's literally people positioning his body, like the way that he physically shows up to make him tough and rigid and independent and whatever, and to not like show emotion or wear makeup, things like that, right? Okay. Any final thoughts before we watch it again? Would you mind pressing? Thank you, Taylor. You're going to want the volume up almost all of it. noticed some of these things that other folks said?
I think we covered it pretty good.
Yeah, I think so too. Yeah. Do you see this playing out in Middlebury at all? Yeah?
Yeah.
Where, would you mind saying a little bit about what you know?
Well, I think, we have Middlebury College here,
Yeah.
and they bring a lot of diversity to the community. We have the Town Hall Theater and film festivals, and I think we do get a little bit here, not a whole bunch, not like Burlington or other states or
Yeah.
cities, but we get a little bit.
Absolutely, and we're gonna talk about this in a little bit, but there can also be a component of safety, like people feeling safe enough to express themselves. Right?
Sure.
Yeah. So there may be more people than you know, potentially. Vermont has one of the highest percentages of LGBTQ plus people in the nation. What, any other comments before we move on? And also, we talked about women for a moment and some of the expectations put on women, but what about men? What are some of the expectations that you noticed?
Money makers for the family, they get, I don't know.
Supposed to be tough and rugged and
Tough, rugged, money-making, smell like gasoline.
yeah, do repairs and not the food
Yeah.
cooking or whatever, the difference, yeah,
Yeah.
that kind of stuff.
All right, well, if any other questions come up, by all means. Let's see.
So, moving into our next part, we're going to separate out sex, gender, and sexuality and get a good understanding there. Have folks seen the gender uniform before? Yeah? Have maybe a gender-bred person in the past? No. I have a quick little soapbox moment around the gender unicorn. So originally it was the gender-bred person, and it was created by trans folks as a way to be able to talk about sex, gender, and sexuality. And it just didn't look very good. So the straight guy came along and was like, oh, I'm gonna make it look so much better. And he did. And then he made a whole lot of money off of it by putting it on his website. And trans folks were like, heck no, we're taking it back. And they made it a unicorn. So much better. And another key difference is this one, we see that female, woman, girl, male, man, boy, they're on their own spectrums. Unlike the last one, which had gender identity as a single line with masculinity on one end and femininity on the other, as if they were polar opposites of each other and not their own separate identities. So, getting into this a little bit, we have gender identity first, which is the rainbow in the thought bubble. It's because you are the only person that can know your gender identity. And as Skylar was so perfectly highlighting before, we receive a lot of gendered messaging around how to perform gender and our understanding of gender, that when we're talking about gender identity, it is your own understanding of your gender and the way that you want to perform and be in the world. And that can be anywhere on the female, woman, girl spectrum, male, man, boy, and then we have other. So other is identifying folks who are non-binary, or also taking into account the fact that we are focusing on Western structures today when we're talking about gender and sexuality. So based on different cultures and societies, they may use different terminology to talk about gender. Next we have gender expression, which are the green dots along the outside of the unicorn. It's the way that we walk, we talk, we cut our hair, don't cut our hair, wear makeup, don't wear makeup. It's all of the social cues that we put out into the world around our gender identity. And so again, this can be anywhere on the feminine or masculine spectrum. And it's very much rooted in where you are located. So the way that we perform gender here in Vermont is going to be different from, say, New York City or in California. Here, flannel is very much gender neutral. Anyone can wear it. And then in other parts of the country, maybe it's not the same. And so one big piece here is that gender expression is separate from gender identity. And that's for a couple reasons. One, we're going to perform gender differently based on the day or time, whether we're at work, whether we're with our friends. And the piece that, especially for trans folks or people who are looking to come out as transgender, they may understand their gender as one way and then perform gender in a different. So for example, if someone understood themselves to be a transgender woman, they would know that they are a woman, and their gender expression in those early stages of coming out may present very masculine because of safety concerns, or that piece of having to come out to family or service providers in that process. So it's not invalidating the fact that she is still a woman, but her presentation may not allow for her to perform femininity until she feels safe enough to do so. Does that make sense for folks? Cool. Moving right along, we have sex assigned at birth. It's the only one that's a radio button because it is something that is assigned to someone, not something that someone can understand for themselves. I think it's very nice that they include intersex on here, but again, a majority of the time, folks are put within those two boxes of male or female. It's self-identification when we think around intersex. And lastly, we have physical attraction and emotional attraction, which we talked a little bit about before when we were talking about aromantic and asexual. So physical attraction being the people that you want to get busy with, emotional attraction, deepest, darkest secrets. And this is just saying that sometimes those don't align up for folks, whether it is all the way at the no, or it can be all the way yes, for women, men, or outside of the gender binary as well. A few other things I'm going to put on there. The gender unicorn is ever changing for folks as they come to understand their identity. So the way that someone may identify now may be different a year from now, or even a week from now, or hours, who knows. Especially in the way that we perform gender or the attraction that we have for folks. And it's not just LGBTQ people that are reflected on the gender unicorn. We're all on there. We all have gender identities and sexualities, which is exactly why I gave you a coloring page version of this. So if you're ever in a training that's significantly more boring than this one, you can like color it in, fill out some information about yourself. It'll be a good old time there. Any questions on gender unicorn? Cool. Moving right along. So now we're going to get into minority stress. And today we're going to focus on sex, gender, and sexuality because that's the context of our training. But also understanding when we're talking about marginalized identities, people who hold multiple marginalized identities will have a significantly higher impact from the minority stress model that we're talking about. So that's why this graphic is here, to say that we are also including race, ethnicity, age, ability. All of those pieces also come into play when we're talking about the minority stress model. It's not mind-blowing. I think you have this information already, again. But when we're talking about minority stress, what we're thinking about is folks within marginalized communities experience stress and anxiety at higher levels than folks outside of those communities. And so what we're truly focusing on there is stigma, prejudice, bias, and hate, and the ways that those show up for folks. And the way that I like to talk about minority stress, as you could have probably guessed by now, is telling a story in the process. So we're going to focus on a trans patient who is coming into a medical setting. So in this setting, they are starting to understand their trans identity and want to talk through that with their doctor. And in that process, the doctor says, I don't understand what you're talking about, this is not my field, that we're not going to have this conversation today. And essentially shows the patient that they are not welcome in that space to be able to have those conversations. And so that would be an experience of a prejudice event, going to access services that are readily available to them and not being able to receive those services. And so the hope is that the patient, if they are looking for any kind of medical intervention for their trans identity, that they would continue to go see another doctor. Or if another health concern comes up, the hope is that they'd be able to go see a doctor or another provider that would be able to help them out. But now they have this expectation of rejection. So I went into the doctor this one time, I got rejected, I don't know if I want to go back to them. They can hope that a different facility or provider would be able to, provide the best possible services for them. But the expectation is there that it's just not going to go well. So what we see sometimes, especially with identities that are not on the surface level, is folks will hide or conceal their identity, so present in an inauthentic way. For instance, if it was a trans woman, she may start presenting very masculine to be able to access services like going to the doctor. And in that process, we start to see this internalization of the external messages of homophobia and transphobia. So those are messages that come from society, within family structures, across the ways that we see discrimination come out. And when that starts to happen, we see people turn to ameliorative coping processes. And what I mean by that are coping processes that are actually negative or detrimental to one's health. So we're thinking any kind of substance use, whether that's alcohol, tobacco, or harder substances, or suicidal ideation or self-harm in a way to reduce that stress and anxiety to be able to continue on. And all of the big corporations are very much onto this. Sweet. The one that stands out most is the one that kicked it off, which was the tobacco industry. So back in the 80s, they released this campaign called SCUM, or Subculture Urban Marketing. And what they did was they started to take on pride messaging in a time where it was absolutely taboo to talk about LGBTQ identities. It was not conversations happening on the mainstream or even among cultures in society. But they were willing to put out messaging that had same-gender couples on the posters, take on this rainbow-esque advertising, as well as this one that really stands out to me, which talks about the freedom to speak, to choose, to marry, participate, be, disagree, inhale, as long as you're smoking American spirits. And so the piece that stands out to me is this right to marry. Again, an ad that is coming out in the late 80s talking about marriage equality when it's not on the main stage of conversations, that is saying we are here with you. And we know that nicotine is going to significantly reduce your stress and anxiety. And so now we see that LGBT individuals are 3 times more likely to actively use tobacco or nicotine products. More specifically, cigarettes stand out among the rest, but we have new data that is coming in around vaping and e-cigarette use for younger LGBTQ folks. But that is to come in the future. So starting with tobacco, and then we move to alcohol. And so all of these advertisements are current. You can see them out anywhere. And what we see here is, again, taking on that rainbow messaging or that pride messaging and saying, we see you, we're here with you. And alcohol companies even go as far as sponsoring pride events that happen across the nation because they know that LGBT individuals are 4 to 5 times more likely to heavy drink or binge drink within the last year. So heavy drinking, we're thinking of someone who is drinking 4 or more alcoholic beverages multiple times throughout a week, versus binge drinking, which is having 5 or more alcoholic beverages within one setting. And as we know, both alcohol and tobacco have negative health impacts for one's body. And so we have some evidence here in the state of Vermont as the impact that minority stress has. Next slide, please. And so what we know is that LGBTQ plus adults are nearly twice as likely to have been diagnosed with a depressive or anxiety disorder within the last year. And we get this data from the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance Survey, which is done every 2 years on a statewide level. And what they also saw in that survey is that this diagnosis was due to the lack of social and emotional support that LGBTQ individuals were able to get, whether that's from services or from their immediate support systems like family and friends. And honestly, we don't have great data around health disparities here in the state of Vermont for LGBTQ folks, because the way that the BRFSS is actually performed is they place 5,000 phone calls across the state of Vermont to get that information. So we're thinking of folks who have access to a telephone line to be able to take the survey. We're thinking of folks who have the time and availability to answer their, I believe it's a 20 to 25 minute long survey on the phone. And lastly, if folks are getting misgendered from the moment they're picking up the phone, they are less likely to continue on in that survey because they know that their identity has been invalidated right off the bat. But where we do get really great data is from the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, which again is done every 2 years. And there's something about having middle and high school students confined in schools where they're given papers all the time. They're willing to fill out the survey very honestly. And what we get from that is that we know that LGBT youth are 4 times more likely to actively think about or try to kill themselves within the last year here in the state of Vermont. And 2 years ago, so when we're thinking in 2016, LGBT youth were actually 6 times more likely to actively think about or try to kill themselves. Some staggering numbers there. And a big piece is that for 2016, they were only focusing on lesbian, gay, and bisexual identities, versus in 2018, where they finally started tracking trans identities within the survey. But another piece of information that we know is that having one supportive adult in that youth's life, one adult that's able to see them wholly and authentically, whether it's a parent or guardian, a guidance counselor, a mental health provider, that reduces their risk of suicide by half. So taking this staggering number of 4 times more likely to 2 times. So, it's important work that we're doing here today. Any questions on all of this? Cool. Well, if anything comes up, feel free to ask, but we're gonna transition into ways that we can change our language to be more inclusive.
Wow, starting off with a real good pun.
Mhm.
All right, so like Taylor said, starting to talk a little bit about language again. If you're noticing a theme, I'm really good at asking questions and trying to make you all come out of your shells and talk a little bit. And Taylor's extremely good at offering high amounts of content. So prepare to be asked questions is what I'm saying. I'm gonna do a Vermont thing and recycle paper here. If I can, maybe I can. This is the first attempt. Ooh. Okay, classy. Maybe that's not gonna work. Maybe, okay, whatever. So when we talk about language, the question that I like to start off by asking is the importance of impact versus intent. So what I mean by that is if you're working with a client, why does it matter specifically knowing the difference between your intentions in that interaction and how they experience that interaction? That's not a fire alarm or something, is it?
I don't think so. I don't know the one.
Just incoming emergency. Okay. Yeah,
Can you repeat that?
sure, of course.
Thanks.
So when we're thinking about the ways that we interact with patients, or maybe it's with another coworker or a friend, family member, it could be anybody. It's LGBT plus people are everywhere, whether you know it or not. Why does it matter the difference between our intentions in an interaction and how that interaction might actually land, or the impact that it may have?
Well, because it doesn't really matter what your intention is, it's their experience
Yeah.
that matters. If they say it's, people aren't gonna remember what you said, they're gonna remember how you made them
Thank you. Yeah, that's that's one really important point. So, I love the way you framed that. I wish I could repeat it exactly as you said it. So, we may have really positive intentions in an interaction, and at the end of the day, what matters in that interaction is the impact that it had on that patient, right? Or human in our lives that we're interacting with, right? Any other reasons that this difference matters?
I mean, I think about the whole Porter mission is to help a healthy community, and if you're excluding half the community because they don't feel like they can get the care, like you were saying, they don't feel like they can come and get care, then
Yeah.
you're not really hitting your mission. You're kind of missing the mark a little bit. So it's important that we include and use the language so that they feel they can get taken care of.
Totally, right. And this is this concept in particular is transferable to a lot of marginalized identities, right? We can think about this with ability, race, etc. Yeah. Or just in general.
Right, I just think
Yeah.
treat everybody as human beings that we are.
Yeah.
And you'll go,
So, may I challenge you a little bit?
yeah,
Why do you think we have specific trainings focusing on LGBTQ plus folks and things like that?
I don't know.
I'm putting you on the spot. It's
Yeah,
okay.
you are. I'm trying to-
It's okay.
I don't know.
That's okay. Yeah. Thanks for humoring me.
The most neglected in the healthcare community.
Most impacted? Yeah. When we say the word marginalized, why do we use that word? Yeah. So when we think about a piece of paper, it has margins.
Right.
So when we're making decisions, when we're setting up policies or thinking about, a good example are those survey calls, right? If the person who's just coming up with these calls does not identify as LGBTQ and maybe isn't aware, maybe hasn't been to one of these trainings and says, oh, just call them and say, Mr. So-and-so, Mrs. So-and-so, would you like to answer these questions, right? The people who are at the center, or who are being thought of, are the people who have the identities that are most common in the room, so to speak. And the people who are on the edges or who are being forgotten about, not being thought of in those interactions, are marginalized or being pushed off to the sides, if you will. They're not at the center of those decisions. So that can look like something as simple as who's included in our non-discrimination policy, or the ways that we welcome each other into the room, which is what I'm going to talk about in just a minute. We have all of these interactions that we have on a day-to-day basis that are based off of often our experiences with the world. We have like a bias that we carry with us, meaning that I make assumptions that other people experience the world similarly to me, therefore what would work really well for me would probably work really well for others. But that doesn't work for people who have different identities and different experiences. So if somebody uses a wheelchair, for example, and needed a door to be a little bit broader, somebody else might not think about that. I might not think about that. And to that person, that's the difference of being able to show up or not show up at all. Does that make sense? So it's a lot of, beyond just language, a lot of this comes down to decisions that are made on a daily basis, or maybe it's a one-time basis that might seem malign, if you will, and have impacts on who accesses our services. So the other big point that I like to make when we're talking about impact versus intent is that when does intent matter?
Say that again, when what?
When does intent matter?
When
It doesn't matter in that
When
interaction.
does it matter?
When does it matter?
Anytime you interact with somebody, I suppose.
Maybe, but we just talked about how the impact of that interaction, like your intent doesn't matter if you had a negative impact in that moment, right?
Right.
Which is hard to swallow, and your intent doesn't change the impact of that
Right.
interaction. But it does change what you can do differently tomorrow, or the next time you see that patient, the next opportunity you have something to change something in your interactions. So what I would ask is, just moving through the rest of this training, and just in general in your life, you know, if you find yourself feeling really guilty, or maybe shameful, some gross feeling, but sad even, trying to move from that place and move to action, move to, okay, how can I do this differently next time? Because it's going to be more comfortable for you, and it's also going to be more comfortable for the people that you're working with. Does that make sense?
It does make sense, but could you give an example?
Sure. So if you walk into, let's say with Eugene Yang, let's say that Eugene was in the room, or actually it doesn't matter if they were in the room. Let's say that Eugene uses they, them pronouns, but I've been referring to them, actually I think in this room we've been referring to Eugene with he, him pronouns, right? The intent was not to harm Eugene.
Right.
And then we find out Eugene uses they, them pronouns, right? We find out, and then instead of feeling really guilty about it or shameful, like, oh, I messed up their pronouns, focusing on, oh, okay, I'll just refer to Eugene by they moving forward. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So with the client, if you find out their pronouns, making sure we're using them moving forward. Thanks. Yeah. I should just motion to you. We forgot our little clicker today, so. So next we're going to talk about gendered language versus not gendered language. So what I mean by that is, day-to-day interactions, we have words that imply a gender, like you guys, hey girls, ladies and gentlemen.
Totally, yeah.
Yeah, can folks come up with some examples?
You just hit them all.
Oh, there's so many more. So many more. Guys, gals, ladies and gentlemen. I can also just list them. That's an option there. But since this is a small training, we actually have very convenient that this was left here. From a past training, a list that folks came up with. So let's see what they came up with.
All right, how many were in that class first?
Right.
Or,